Most people will spend their entire lives trying to earn their way to wealth and never question why it isn't working. The problem was never the income. It was always the structure. Thousands of years ago, Solomon recorded a principle so simple, so quietly powerful, that modern financial culture walked right past it without recognition. He did not write about earning more. He wrote about what the wise protect before anything else is touched. Wealth, in the ancient world, was never measured by what entered a household, only by what remained inside it. Tell me in the comments, were you ever taught this about money? There is a principle that has existed for over 3,000 years. It was not hidden in a vault. It was not encoded in a secret text. It was not passed down through private societies or whispered between powerful men in closed rooms. It was written openly, translated into dozens of languages, and placed inside one of the most widely distributed books in human history, and most people walked right past it. Not because the principle was difficult to understand, not because it required specialized knowledge or rare intelligence, but because it describes something so quiet, so unglamorous, so structurally simple, that a culture obsessed with speed and display never stopped long enough to recognize what it was actually looking at. This video is about that principle, what it is, where it came from, why it works, and why the people who follow it rarely announce that they do. Take a moment to look at the financial landscape around you. Not the headlines, not the market commentary, not the advice columns or the productivity frameworks or the 10-step systems promising a different outcome. Set all of that aside and simply observe what is happening at the ground level. In ordinary households, across ordinary careers, people are earning more than any previous generation in recorded history. Adjusted or not, the raw purchasing power available to the average working individual today would have seemed almost incomprehensible to someone living 2 centuries ago. Technology has multiplied income opportunities. Remote work has opened new income streams. Side income has become a normal conversation. And yet, the pattern persists. Income raises, spending raises to meet it. And at the end of the month, in the accounting of what actually remains, the number is approximately what it was before the raise, before the promotion, before the extra effort. This is not a personal failure. It is a structural one. And understanding the difference between those two things is where this entire conversation begins. The problem is not how much money is entering the household. The problem is what happens to money once it arrives. Most financial thinking is built around a single assumption so deeply embedded that people rarely question it. The assumption is this: if you want to build wealth, you need to increase your income, earn more, work more, hustle more. The logic seems reasonable on the surface. More money coming in should produce more money remaining. And yet the historical evidence, not just modern data, but evidence stretching back thousands of years, suggests this assumption is incomplete. Consider 2 individuals. They are peers, same profession, same salary, same cost of living, same city. Their income is identical, down to the last dollar. And yet, 10 years from now, one will have built something durable. The other will still be waiting for the next raise to change their situation. What separates them is not income. It never was. What separates them is structure. One of them treats all incoming money as available money. Whatever arises can be spent on needs first, then wants, then whatever remains. This is how most people operate. It feels natural. It feels honest. Spend what you have when you need to spend it. The other operates from a different framework entirely. One that is older than modern banking, older than financial theory, older, even, than the word investment as we now use it. In the ancient world, Solomon was recognized as the wealthiest and wisest ruler of his era. His observations were not the observations of a theorist. They were the observations of a man who governed vast resources, oversaw enormous trade networks, and watched closely how families either held their wealth across generations or quietly lost it within one. What he recorded in Proverbs was not instruction in how to earn. It was instruction in how to structure what you earn. There is a passage, simple, almost unremarkable in its phrasing, that describes how the wise store treasure and oil in their dwelling, oil and grain, not luxuries, not symbols of extravagance. These were the functional resources of an ancient household: food, fuel, the materials that made daily life possible. The wise, Solomon observed, stored them, not all of them. Not in reckless excess, but a consistent, protected portion was always set aside within the household before the rest was distributed or consumed. To the modern reader, this might sound like basic budgeting advice. But that interpretation misseth the depth of what is being described. Because in the ancient household economy, the act of storing before consuming was not a financial strategy. It was a statement of identity. It declared something about how a household understood its relationship to time, to uncertainty, and to the resources passing through its hands. Solomon observed something most people overlook. Wealth was never defined by what entered a household. It was defined by what remained inside it. This is the assumption break, and it is worth sitting with. The modern financial mind looks at income as the source of wealth. Earn more, and wealth will follow. But the ancient discipline reversed this entirely. Wealth, in this framework, was not a product of income. It was a product of preservation. The word preservation here is not a metaphor. Ancient households preserved grain. They preserved oil. They preserved coin. Physical, tangible, carefully protected reserves that sat untouched while the regular business of life continued around them. The household that had these reserves was not merely comfortable. It was structurally different from the household that did not. When a difficult season arrived, a poor harvest, an unexpected cost, a disruption in trade, one household had a buffer, the other had nothing. And this is where the principle reveals its first layer of depth. The reserve did not just protect against hardship, it changed how every subsequent financial decision was made. A household with reserves moved slowly, deliberately. It could decline a bad arrangement because it was not desperate. It could wait for the right opportunity because it was not reactive. It could think across years instead of scrambling across weeks. The household without reserves had no such luxury. Every financial decision was made under the pressure of immediate need. Urgency replaced patience. Necessity replaced judgment. And over years and decades, these two modes of decision-making produced vastly different outcomes, even when the original income was identical. This principle has a name. Call it the reserve treasure law. It is not a modern framework. It is not a productivity method. It is not a savings rate target or an investment allocation percentage. It is older and simpler than any of those things. The reserve treasure law states that a protected portion of incoming resources must always be preserved before any spending decision is made, before the bills are paid, before the groceries are purchased, before any discretionary choice is made. A portion is moved into reserve. Not borrowed from, not reconsidered. Protected. Ancient households practiced this instinctively. The grain that went into storage was not available grain. It existed in a separate category. The distinction was not just logistical, it was psychological. That portion had already left the pool of spendable resources the moment it arrived. It belonged to the reserve. And this is the point most people miss when they encounter saving advice in modern contexts. They are told to save what is left over after spending. Save the remainder. Keep what you can. The ancient discipline reversed this sequence entirely. Preserve first, then determine what remains for everything else. The difference between those two approaches is not marginal. Over time, it is the difference between two entirely different financial identities. Consider the identity this creates. There is a salaried worker who receives their income each month. They pay their obligations, cover their costs, manage their life, and save what remains, if anything remains. This person relates to money as a flow that passes through them. Income arrives. Expenses absorb it. And the financial self is defined by what happens in between. Now consider a second person with the same income. The moment their payment arrives, a fixed portion moves immediately into reserve. Not a flexible portion. Not whatever I can manage this month. A fixed, predetermined amount that is treated as already gone from the spendable pool. What remains after that preservation is what funds the rest of their life. This person does not think about money the same way. They do not experience their income the same way. Their financial identity is not defined by the flow. It is defined by the reserve that quietly accumulates beneath the surface of ordinary life. Disciplined families follow a different structure. They never treat their full income as spendable money. This separation, this quiet, unglamorous division, made at the moment income arrives, is the first and most foundational act of the reserve treasure law. Everything that follows in the architecture of wealth rests on whether this separation is made or ignored. Now there is a deeper layer to this. Because the reserved portion does more than simply accumulate. Over time, it changes the nature of every decision made around it. It shifts time horizon. It shifts risk tolerance. It shifts the psychological relationship between a person and the resources they manage. A household without reserves lives inside a very short window of time. Every decision is framed by what is needed now or within the next few weeks. Urgency shapes judgment. And urgency is an expensive way to move through the world. A household with reserves lives inside a longer window. Decisions can be delayed without consequence. Poor opportunities can be declined without panic. The question is no longer what can I afford right now, but what is actually worth committing to. Solomon observed something most people overlook. The reserve is not the destination of wealth, it is the instrument that makes real financial judgment possible. And this is only the beginning of what the reserve treasure law reveals. Because the mechanism does something else. Something quieter. Something that does not become visible until the reserve has been maintained with discipline over a long enough period of time. That layer, the one that separates those who merely save from those who actually build, is what comes next. The reserve accumulates in silence. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about it. It does not announce itself. It does not produce visible signs of progress in the early months. There is no moment where someone looks at a disciplined household and immediately recognizes what is happening beneath the surface. The reserve builds quietly, consistently, in the background of ordinary life, while everything visible about that household appears almost identical to any other. This is by design, not a deliberate concealment, but a natural consequence of how the reserve treasure law actually functions. Wealth, in this framework, is not a display. It is a structure. And structures, by their nature, are most powerful when they are stable and hidden, not when they are visible and celebrated. Ancient households practiced this instinctively. The stored grain was not placed at the entrance of the home. The preserved oil was not discussed at the market. The family that had built reserves across 3 seasons did not announce it to their neighbors. They simply had it. And that quiet possession changed everything about how they moved through the world. Here is the deeper layer. A reserve, maintained with discipline over time, does not merely protect. It generates something that cannot be manufactured quickly, cannot be borrowed, and cannot be replaced once it is lost. It generates options. Options are the true currency of long-term wealth. Not income, not assets. In the abstract sense, the practical ability to choose to say yes to something rare when it appears. To say no to something harmful without consequence. To wait without suffering. This is what the reserve actually produces over time. Consider the merchant in the ancient world who had stored provisions through 3 prosperous seasons. When drought arrived and prices collapsed for those without reserves, this merchant did not panic. He did not sell at a loss. He did not borrow at unfavorable terms. He simply waited. And when conditions shifted as they always do, he was positioned to move from a place of stability rather than desperation. The reserve transforms uncertainty into stability. This is not a metaphor. It is a mechanical reality. Uncertainty is dangerous only to those who have no buffer against it. For the household that has preserved consistently, uncertainty becomes something different. It becomes the condition under which others make poor decisions while they remain calm. This is the hidden leva, the thing that is never mentioned in modern conversations about saving or building wealth. The reserve does not just protect against the bad. It creates asymmetric advantage during difficult periods. When others are forced to react, the disciplined household can choose. Control always precedes prosperity. This was understood in the ancient world as a basic fact of household management. It is as true today as it was 3,000 years ago. Now consider what discipline actually requires in practice. Not in theory, not as an abstract value, but as a daily, functional behavior applied to real income, in a real life, surrounded by real social pressure to spend. The cultural environment most people inhabit is not designed to support preservation. It is designed to support consumption. Every commercial message, every social signal, every visible marker of status communicates the same basic instruction: spend what you have, and if possible, spend slightly beyond it. Against this environment, the reserve treasure law asks something that feels almost counterintuitive. It asks for structure where impulse is the norm. It asks for patience where urgency is rewarded. It asks for invisible discipline where visible spending is celebrated. This is the psychological challenge that the ancient wisdom literature acknowledged directly. The Proverbs are not naive about human nature. They do not assume discipline is easy or natural. They describe it as something practiced by the wise, which implies, without stating it directly, that the unwise do not practice it. The wise preserve before they consume. Not occasionally, not when convenient, not in the months when finances feel comfortable. Consistently, as structure, as identity. This is the reframe that changes everything. Most people experience their financial life as a series of decisions about money. Should I buy this or not? Should I save more this month? Should I spend on this, want, or wait? Each decision is treated as an individual event, evaluated on its own terms, influenced by mood and circumstance and social context. The reserve treasure law does not operate through individual decisions. It operates through structure that precedes decisions. When the preserved portion is moved into reserve at the moment, income arrives before any decision is considered. Before any option is evaluated, the subsequent decisions become structurally different. The pool of available resources is smaller. The psychological framing shifts. And over time, the person no longer thinks of their full income as their available money. They think of the reduced amount, the amount after preservation, as the whole. This mental division is not a trick. It is a fundamental reorganization of how money is perceived. Wealth builders mentally divide money before they ever touch it. The reserve is not what is left over. It is what is taken first, and everything else is managed within what remains. This shift, applied consistently over months and years, does not just change financial outcomes. It changes financial identity. The person who operates from this structure is not the same financial entity as the person who spends freely and saves what remains. They think differently. They move differently. They make different decisions under the same conditions. Wealth is not money itself. It is control over how money flows. This is the psychological reframe that the ancient discipline produces in those who practice it long enough. There is a version of ambition that modern culture promotes relentlessly. Work harder. Earn more, optimize income, find the next opportunity, the next stream, the next vehicle. The premise beneath all of it is the same. If the income number is large enough, wealth will follow automatically. But income without structure is simply a larger pool of water with the same drain. The drain remains. The flow increases. And the level inside the household stays approximately the same because the structure that would retain anything has never been built. Effort without structure produces motion, not wealth. This distinction matters enormously. Motion can feel like progress. A larger salary feels like advancement. A new income stream feels like a solution. But without the foundational discipline of preservation, without the reserve treasure law operating beneath everything else, the motion simply accelerates an existing pattern. The ancient wisdom literature does not celebrate relentless striving. It celebrates disciplined stewardship. These are different postures. Striving is about acquisition. Stewardship is about what you do with what you already have. Solomon's observations were made in a context of enormous abundance. He was not writing from poverty or scarcity. He was observing, from a position of vast resources, how households either retained and grew what they received or consumed it entirely and were left with nothing to show. For years of effort, the conclusion he reached was not earn more. It was structure what you earn. Preservation is the beginning of abundance, not the end. The beginning. The daily practice of this law is simpler than most people expect. It is not a complex system. It does not require financial expertise or specialized knowledge. It requires only one repeated behavior, applied without exception, each time income arrives. When money enters your life in any amount, from any source, a fixed portion moves immediately into a protected reserve. Not a flexible portion determined each time by how comfortable the month feels. A fixed, predetermined amount. Decided once. Applied consistently. The amount matters less than the consistency. Ancient households did not store grain only in good harvests. They stored in every season, adjusting for what arrived but never abandoning the practice, because conditions were difficult. The discipline was not conditional. It was structural. Once the preserved portion is moved, it is no longer considered available. This is the psychological line that separates those who save occasionally from those who build consistently. The reserve is not a pool to be borrowed from when desire arises or circumstances feel urgent. It is a separate category entirely, one that sits outside the daily financial calculus and accumulates without interruption. Small disciplined actions eventually shape financial identity. Not in weeks. Not in a few months of strong effort. Over years, quietly, as the reserve grows and the behavioral pattern becomes the natural default rather than the conscious effort. Here is the warning worth offering. Impatience is the most common reason this discipline collapses. The reserve does not produce dramatic results in the early period. The first months of consistent preservation look almost identical to any other month. The amount is small. The progress feels invisible. And because visible progress is absent, the mind begins to generate reasons why an exception is reasonable. Why this month is different. Why the reserve can be accessed just this once and rebuilt later. Ancient reserves were not built quickly. The grain stores that sustained a household through a difficult season were filled gradually. Season after season, through consistent behavior that produced no visible transformation in any single cycle. Wealth grows quietly before it becomes visible. This is not a comforting phrase. It is a structural description of how the reserve treasure law actually functions across time. The compounding is not dramatic. The turning point, when it arrives, is not announced. One day, the reserve is simply large enough to change the nature of every decision made around it, and the household finds itself in a different position, not because of a single dramatic choice, but because of thousands of small, consistent, unglamorous acts of preservation. Patience, in this context, is not a virtue in the inspirational sense. It is a structural requirement. The law does not work without it. The principle has existed for over 3,000 years. It was not hidden. It was placed openly inside ancient wisdom literature, available to anyone who stopped long enough to read it carefully. Solomon observed it in the households of his time. He recorded it plainly. The wise store treasure and oil. The wise preserve before they consume. The wise treat their resources as something to be protected, not simply as something to be spent. What makes this principle remarkable is not its complexity. It has almost no complexity. What makes it remarkable is how rarely it is actually practiced and how large the difference becomes over time between those who practice it and those who do not. Two people, same income, same starting point, same city, same obligations, same opportunities. One structures their money around preservation. The other does not. Give them 20 years. The divergence will not require explanation. It will simply be visible. Wealth belongs to those who preserve before they spend. Not the most talented earners. Not the most aggressive investors. Not the people who found the right opportunity or the right moment. The people who quietly, consistently, across ordinary months and ordinary years, protected a portion of what arrived before allowing any of it to disappear. This was the discipline of ancient households. It shaped durable wealth across generations in a world without banks, without financial instruments, without the infrastructure modern earners take for granted. It worked then because the underlying human behavior it addressed, the tendency to consume what arrives, has never changed. It will work now for the same reason. The principle was never hidden, it was simply ignored. The question, now, is whether you choose to ignore it too. The reserve treasure law: preserve first. Structure everything. Build in silence.